Welcome to the Margaret Fuller Society session, which is entitled, Where in the World is Margaret Fuller? I hope for most of us that a footnote won't be necessary, but I will say that that title echoes the time-honored video game, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? And a member of the Fuller Society cleverly made that up to cover both our society and the Louisa May Alcott Society, which will be having a kind of partner session tomorrow. As for Fuller, between her reading and her actual life adventures, she certainly can be all over the world. Without doubt, at least this is my claim, she's the most cosmopolitan of all the Transcendentalists. And our panelists offer some of that range, both in their own lives and in what they're speaking of today. With regret, ascending regret, Mario Benoni is unable to attend the gathering, but I will be reading his paper for him. So I will introduce all four speakers first, and then we'll just proceed. Alice de Galzain, and I meant to ask you how to pronounce your last name. Perfect. Alice de Galzain is a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh. Both French and Italian in heritage, she has studied in many different countries, including France, Germany, Italy, and the United States. Specializing in 19th century American lit, her research interests include American Transcendentalism, transnational writing, abolitionism, and women's studies. Her PhD project focuses on the Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson relationship, especially as she aims to understand the implications of their redefinitions of womanhood and concept of Americanness. Second presenter will be Cheryl Weaver, and Cheryl is currently completing her dissertation at the University of Buffalo on American women's letter writing networks. Her scholarly interests include 19th century American literature, especially Dickinson and Fuller, epistolary fictions, and the pragmatics of postal delivery and practice, even across the Atlantic as part of letter writing history. It occurred to me that that is potentially relevant to all the writers, all the topics that we're considering today. The Postal Service made it all possible. Mario Benoni, whom, as I say, I will be reading his paper. Mario is a sixth generation Roman, studied languages and literatures at La Sapienza University, and then marketing at Arizona State University. As an independent scholar, Benoni has done extensive research on Fuller's Italian experience, combining bilingual textual recovery with on-the-ground knowledge. This year is publishing an annotated translation into Italian of Fuller's dispatches to the New York Tribune, and he seeks an American fiscal agent to support publication of his edition in English of the Italian letters of Margaret Fuller, Giovanni Angelo Osili, and their correspondence. Fourth, Julia X. Du received her BA and MA degrees from Peking University, studied briefly at Oxford University, then completed her PhD at Brandeis. She works in the software industry and translated and translates academic and literary books. Her Chinese translation of Walden, the annotated edition, annotated by Thoreau Institute curator Jeffrey Kramer, has been well received in China. So Alice, it's yours.
Gonna actually move this here. Hello, everyone. I am so happy and grateful to be here. And as a PhD student, my budget is so limited. So I need to thank Phyllis, James Finley, John Cusick, and other people for getting me here. And yeah, it feels really good. So my talk today is entitled Woman and Artist, Margaret Fuller on Bettine, Brentano-von Arnim, and Friendship. This is just a brief chronology there. Don't worry if you can't see it, it's just dates. And I'll try to read them out loud as I go. So conversation was a fundamental aspect of Margaret Fuller's career. Etymologically, the word comes from the Latin convertere, to turn around, which perfectly encapsulates the life of a thinker whose work contributed to inspire the rise of the women's rights movement in the United States. Described by Ralph Waldo Emerson as the best conversationalist in America in the posthumous biography Memoirs of Margaret Fuller Society, published in 1852, Fuller excelled at this oratory art, which defined both her intimate relationships and her career. Her Boston Conversations, a series of discussions for women that she held between 1839 and 1844, allowed her to engage critically with topics such as Greek mythology, ethics, and woman. She also remained within the confines of what was considered acceptable, as opposed to the more masculine lecture. And with participants paying a fee, these encounters also enabled Fuller to earn a living. What's more, Fuller's writing was characterized by an innovative conversational method. And yet, in the eyes of her contemporaries, her written work was often described as highly inferior to her conversation. Conversation is also a term that characterizes the communities to which Fuller belonged and in which she revolved. For, as Charlene Avalon points out, open quote, Fuller's discussion of woman entered a dialogue in progress, end quote. One of the communities to which Fuller took great interest in, perhaps more than any other transcendentalist, was the one of German Romantics. A major proponent of Goethe at a time when he was under regular attack in America, Fuller translated his Torquato Tasso, shortening the title to Tasso, sometime around 1833. Unlike her translation of Johann Peter von Eckermann's Conversation with Goethe, which appeared in 1839, Fuller's Tasso was never published in her lifetime, except for a few passages which were included in an 1842 Dial review of a book entitled Conjectures and Researches Concerning the Love, Madness, and Imprisonment of Torquato Tasso. In the same issue of the Dial, Fuller also included a partial translation of Bettine Brentano-von Arnim's second epistolary novel, entitled Die Gunderode, which appeared in 1840, and which related her relationship with the poetess Caroline von Gunderode. It is on that specific work that this paper focuses, aiming to examine Fuller's understanding of friendship, which greatly influenced Emerson's, by analyzing her article/translation, Bettine Brentano and her friend Gunderode. I plan to read Fuller's account of the Brentano-Gunderode relationship in comparison with Emerson's section in Memoirs entitled Woman or Artist, in order to show how Fuller's gendered commentary allowed her to resolve the constraining 19th century dichotomy that weighed on all women writers at the time. Fuller's idealization of the friendship between the two women, I argue, is a celebration of the transcending power of life, intended both as sexual and artistic reproduction. In a journal entry written in February 1841, Fuller noted, I prefer Die Gunderode to Bettine's correspondence with Goethe. The two girls are equal natures and both in earnest. One thing that Brentano and Goethe's relationship lacked, according to Fuller, was indeed a sense of balance. And it is on that lack of balance that Fuller's article opens, focusing on Bettine's fascination for the writer and leaving Caroline aside. Gunderode is indeed curiously absent from the beginning of Fuller's text, which opens on the dangers of idolatrous relationships. While noting that, I quote, idolatries are natural to youthful hearts, Fuller states that when this worship is expressed, there must be singular purity and strength of character on the part of both idol an idolater, to prevent its degenerating into a mutual excitement of vanity or mere infatuation, end quote. In 1839, Fuller had written that Bettine, I quote, has followed like a slave where she might as a pupil, end quote, suggesting that Bettine's admiration for Goethe was one which had degenerated, for it was characterized by a very uneven balance of power. In her Günderode article, she reasserts that, I quote, the relation in which she, Bettine, stands to Goethe is not a beautiful one, end quote, precisely because, open quote, it is too unequal, end quote. Christina Zweig provides a very interesting commentary on Fuller's choice or use of that slave master language in her monograph, Feminist Conversations. Fuller was very critical of Goethe's position. In her journal, she wrote, Goethe had made a puppet show for his private entertainment of Bettine's life. But today, I want to focus on a very different type of relationship, a harmonious one. The somewhat toxic Brentano-Goethe relationship indeed acts as a foil to another more successful friendship, the one between Brentano and Günderode, or Bettine and Caroline. Fuller's article indeed reads as a celebration of the notion of harmony, intended as complementarity rather than similarity, on which Fuller writes, I quote, the advantage in years, the higher culture and greater harmony of Günderode's nature is counterbalanced by the ready springing impulse, richness, and melody of the other, end quote. Musical harmony, alluded to through words such as melody, springing impulse, richness, is used to characterize the friendship between the two women whom, despite embodying, I quote, two different modes of life, end quote, are, open quote, the two beautiful figures which animate and portray these modes of life and are in perfect harmony with them, end quote. Günderode herself, of a more delicate and reserved nature than Bettine, wrote, I quote, thou hast a much more energetic nature than I, indeed than almost any of whom I am able to judge, end quote. However, Fuller notes that these differences constitute no drawback upon the beauty of this intimacy. She writes, she explained, there being sufficient nearness of age to give Günderode just the advantage needful with so daring a child as Bettine, and a sufficient equality in every other respect, end quote. Once again, this contrasts with Brentano's age difference from Goethe, who was 26 years older than her. In fact, Bettine's mother, Maximiliane, and Goethe had also been friends. However, the friendship ended abruptly, and 35 years later, her daughter took her place. So difference, just like harmony, is a key concept in Fuller's commentary of friendship. For while Fuller begins by opposing the relationship between Goethe and Bettine to the latter's friendship with Caroline, she then goes on to interpret the difference between the two women as follows. She writes, I have distinguished the two as nature and ideal. Bettine, hovering from object to object, drawing new tides of vital energy from all, is not this pervasive vital force cause of the effect which we call nature? And Günderode, harmonizing all objects into their true relations, drawing from every form of life its eternal meaning, end quote. There is so much to say about this important passage, but what I would like to insist upon today is the transformational power of woman's genius. Difference between the two friends can be positive, manifesting itself as a pervasive force that transfigures, harmonizing, and drawing new tides of vital energy. What's more, Fuller depicts this transformational force by the two women as creative and reciprocal. She writes, the action of these two beings upon one another as representing classes of thoughts is thus of the highest poetical significance. As persons, their relation is not less beautiful, end quote. Here, the notion of action and the notion of poetry as well, they come together in a woman-centered spiritual alternative to romantic male poetic creation. Creation is also the main focus of Emerson's section, Woman or Artist, ? In Memoirs. So separated by a comma, the words woman and artist stand in apparent opposition to each other, while the question mark included in the title suggests the presumed impossibility of being both woman and artist. This section of memoirs, the biography that Emerson wrote along with James Freeman Clarke and William Henry Channing, is quite similar in its structure to the rest of the work. Emerson's commentary frames quotations taken from Fuller's letters and journals. The passages written by Emerson in this specific section center on the tension between ideal and real, a tension which echoes the title woman or artist. Art could refer to both craftsmanship and higher art, but here, opposed to woman, a term which was mostly tied to the idea of domesticity in the mid-19th century, it denotes a certain elevated detachment from everyday life. In Emerson's words, this tension is expressed through the contrast between what he calls the disappointing forms of men and women and the children of the muse. He writes, Margaret resolved again and again to devote herself no more to these disappointing forms of men and women, but to the children of the muse. And then he quotes from Fuller, the dramatis personae, she said, of my poems shall henceforth be chosen from the children of the immortal muse. I fix my affections no more on these frail forms, end quote. And then Emerson continues, but it was vain. She rushed back again to persons with a woman's devotion, end quote. The expression children of the muse is very interesting, for it associates the reproductive power of woman to the idealized female figure. Childbirth and childcare are aspects of a woman's life that Bettine Brentano experienced very early on. She married Arnim von Arnim in 1811, and together they had 7 children before he died in 1831. Alongside being a mother of 7, she became an influential writer and political thinker. She also would publish a book called The King's Book. She was familiar with and had an obvious firsthand experience of the toll of domestic duties on women. As Ingrid Fry remarks, I quote, aspiring authors like Fuller possessed few examples of female artists who transcended established social roles and who expressed creative genius as defined in romantic discourse, end quote. Bettine was, at least in some aspects, a model for Fuller, as shown by the letter of admiration that Fuller wrote to her in November 1840. She writes, I write to you in the name of many men and many women of my country, for whom you have wrought wonders. Thou art dear to us. Thou art the friend of our inmost mood, end quote. Using the first person plural pronoun we, Fuller was showing her admiration, but she was also expressing America's gratitude for Bettine's service. Service to whom, might we ask? To intellect and to the cause of women's rights. Even before giving birth to her son Angelino, Fuller, like Bettine, knew what it meant to bear the responsibility of a household. At age 25, upon her father's death, she shouldered heavy responsibilities for her mother and 5 younger siblings. So if by artist we mean an intellectual, then Fuller had to find ways to fructify such a speculative position in order to survive as a woman in the 19th century. Fuller's remarks that are quoted in Emerson's section, Woman or Artist, are unsurprisingly concerned with the ties between artistic creation and gender. I quote, a woman of tact and brilliancy like me has an undue advantage in conversation with men. And gentlemen are surprised that I write no better because I talk so well, but I have served a long apprenticeship to the one, none to the other, end quote. Her comments also reveal the difficulty of being both a woman and an artist. She writes, one should be either private or public. I love best to be a woman, but womanhood is at present too straitly bounded to give me scope. At hours, I live truly as a woman. At others, I should stifle. As on the other hand, I should palsy when I would play the artist, end quote. This tension between public and private is the same on which gender discrimination based itself for a long time. Women's world coinciding with the private sphere, while men were in charge of the public sphere. By publishing her letter exchange with her friend Carolina, Bettine had in some ways managed to redefine women's private life by equating it to genius rather than to domesticity. She provided an insight into the interior of German life, as Fuller writes, which fascinated Fuller to the point perhaps of blinding her a little bit about the reality of German society. She writes, not only are these letters interesting as presenting this view of the interior of German life and of an ideal relation realized, but the high state of culture in Germany had made them expressions of the noblest aspirations, end quote. The nature of Fuller's idealization of the Brentano-Günderode relationship is also astoundingly gendered. Fuller indeed writes that the, I quote, relation presents all that is lovely between woman and woman, adorned by great genius and beauty on both sides, end quote. Fuller also makes a distinction between the friendship between two young girls and two young men as follows. An intimacy between two young men is heroic, as the life of man is to be active. They have still more the air of brothers in arms than of fellow students. But the relation between two young girls is essentially poetic. There is a fluent tenderness, a native elegance in the arrangement of trifling incidents, a sincere childlike sympathy in aspirations that mark the destiny of woman. She should be the poem, man the poet. Poetry as creation is therefore for Fuller a power emanating from true female relationships, while action is more characteristic of male friendships. I want to connect these remarks to another observation made by Fuller and quoted by Emerson in the section Woman or Artist from December 1842. Fuller writes, I have been reading the lives of Lord Herbert of Sherbury and of Sir Kenelm Digby. What I demand of men, that they could act out all their thoughts, these have. They are lives, and of such, I do not care if they had as many faults as they are in the days of the year. There is the energy to redeem them, end quote. This passage shows the importance as well as the meaning. Oh, sorry, I'll be quick. So it shows the importance as well as the meaning of living in Fuller's eyes. It is the capacity for inaction that Fuller admired in these men. They are lives, she writes, precisely because they are able to act out all their thoughts. It is interesting to note that in Memoirs, Emerson links the concept of action to Fuller, but he presents it in a negative light. He writes, there were practical problems Margaret had to entertain and to solve the best way she could, but she was formed for action and addressed herself quite simply to her part. She was a woman, an orphan, without beauty, without money, end quote. It is important that we reflect on how the lives of women intellectuals were narrated. Contrary to Emerson, Fuller managed to suppress the need for any model of male authority in her review of Die Günderode. In fact, Bettine's Günderode was a literary exploit that fully satisfied Fuller's feminism. Serving as an exemplar of female agency, Bettine had taken self-writing and artistic creation into her own hands by publishing her correspondence with Günderode. If Carol Strauss-Soteropoulos writes, I quote, for Fuller, the transformational potential inherent in female friendship complicated the principle of self-reliance inculcated by her father, manifested in her male literary and historical heroes, and formulated it into a philosophy by Emerson, end quote. I think that the transformational potential of Fuller's vision lies in the redefinition of friendship between women as essentially poetic. For Fuller, Bettine and Caroline were in fact women and artists. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
I have about 20.
Great.
So
Would anyone want a brief chronology?
everyone wants a brief chronology. I have about 20, but it'll give you an idea of how the post kind of develops over the time that I'll be speaking. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone here on the panel for indulging me in my love of the postal system, which I know is a strange love, and letter writing itself. So I do appreciate your being here and for having me and indulging me. My paper, my presentation is called "I Found Your Note Here Several Days Since, Margaret Fuller and Postal Delivery from Europe." In a December 1856 letter, Abby Wood Bliss writes to her sister Mary, "You and mother are always asking me about paying postage, and now I will try and explain our system." Bliss, a Christian missionary and lifelong friend of Emily Dickinson, proceeded to document in some detail the practical matter of postal delivery to Beirut, Lebanon. I have always been struck by moments when letter writers inscribe postal practices in their epistles, particularly transatlantic communications. When I read the Margaret Fuller Society's panel, "Where in the World is Margaret Fuller?" I thought of Fuller's travels to and through Europe beginning in August 1846, a decade before Bliss's letter. Did Fuller have "let me explain to you about the post" moments in her private letters? How did she navigate personally and practically her letters apart from the New York Tribune dispatches? Did Fuller even attend to the revolutionary impact of increasingly accessible postal systems? So I took another closer look at her personal letters from the time between August 1846 to July 1847 to attend to moments that the global Fuller let the minutiae of postal practice peek through to enhance our understanding of this revolutionary time of postal growth. Between the 1830s and 1850s, an information revolution occurred in which epistolary exchanges formed sites for ideas, particularly about national identity and transformation, formed. Increasingly efficient and available postal systems paved the way for intellectual epistolary exchanges. These exchanges occurred in what James Howe terms epistolary spaces, the public spaces within which supposedly private writings travel. Epistolary spaces, composed of personal correspondence along public roads, established routes, offices, and official carriers, include the individuals such as Margaret Fuller, who, as Megan Marshall writes, served as a conductor of information. If we think of the organization, infrastructure, and conductors through the metaphor of the body, the postal system functions as the world's fascial tissue, the connective tissue beneath the skin that attaches, stabilizes, encloses, and also separates muscles and internal organs. Fuller, as a conductor of information, plays out in a complicated epistolary space of professional and personal letters. In the 2016 Edinburgh Companion to 19th Century American Letters and Letter Writing, Magdalena Nario writes that Fuller's personal correspondence is where her political and activist ideas form. She explains that Fuller had very little use for the conventional epistolary topics, which can be summarized as health concerns, local news or gossip, or weather. Fuller herself argued that she could do very little in the epistolary form as opposed to her conversations. In Sonia de Loretto's article on the Fuller Archive, she writes that after Fuller's time in Europe, quote, "it became apparent that the life lived by Fuller away from her New England friends and family, with the added interruptions of communication inherent in any epistolary exchange, caused a sense of uncertainty regarding her choices and possibly her ideas. These added interruptions in communication inherent in any epistolary exchange were actually becoming less and less of a hindrance throughout the 19th century, and Fuller traveled in the midst of this tremendous change." Now we're going to get into the exciting postal history. The first half of the 19th century, it is actually exciting, ushered advancements to postal services throughout Europe and the United States. In Europe, the more fragmented and private services, which catered to the aristocratic elite, became organized state-run systems that provided more access to a broader section of the population. The United States Postal Service grew during the 1840s to incorporate a quickly expanding nation, and that also paralleled changes in the British Post. The U.S. Postal Act of 1845, instituted 2 years after Fuller's tour of the western edge of the nation, which at that time would have been the Great Lakes area, that she documented in Summer on the Lakes, reduced postal delivery costs and cut national postal distance parameters from 5 categories to 2. Postal stamps were introduced in Great Britain in 1837, the United States in 1847, and France in 1849, making payment much easier. However, postal historian Richard John explains that while the 1840 British Universal Penny Post decreased the cost of postage for commercial purposes, international postal rates differed. In other words, Britain wanted to profit off international mail. In many European countries, such as Great Britain and France, international mail was a service that should be taxed. In fact, a year after Fuller's fateful return home in 1850, Great Britain's International Postage Association formed in reaction to these high postal rates. The challenges of transatlantic postal delivery meant that a good portion of the United States population did not have economic or material access to transatlantic mail. This changed after the US Civil War, as transatlantic mail increased to more than 25 million by 1875, nearly 3 times more than 1865. Not until 1874 did a treaty established by the International Postal Congress in Bern, Switzerland, establish the World Postal Union, which incorporated the United States into a shared postal space with Europe. The 1840s, the time of Fuller's European travel, marked a time of drastic change in transatlantic postal access. Because Fuller traveled to Europe during this pivotal time of change, but not to the accessibility that developed in the second half of the 19th century, I wondered when, if at all, Fuller may have acknowledged or even advocated for increased access. Acknowledging the difficulties of postal communication, particularly transatlantically, are on the surface obvious, but can be enhanced through understanding the logistics of epistolary spaces and mining these letters for the moments that Fuller breaks from more philosophical or personal content to address the material weight of letters and their cost, instruct correspondents on mailing location, and voice their concerns over proper delivery. Fuller began working for the New York Tribune in 1844 and traveled to Europe in 1846 as a foreign correspondent, a European trip canceled a decade prior after her father's death. Horace Greeley, editor of the Tribune, advanced Fuller $120 for 15 dispatches, while Marcus and Rebecca Spring paid for her lodging and travel expenses in return for her role as her son Edward's tutor. She began her trip in August 1846, traveling with the Springs on the Cunard ship Cambria, which took a mere, quote, 10 days and 16 hours from Boston to Liverpool, according to Fuller's first dispatch. Her trip to Europe, financed by the Springs and Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, was speedy and efficient. In Fuller's letters sent during this period of travel, many of the conventions that are typical of letter writing are certainly present. The temporal and spatial distance often meant a letter became metonymic for the body. Fuller, still longing for the German businessman James Nathan, with whom she had fallen in love, wrote to Thomas Dell from Edinburgh on September 1st, 1846, that Nathan wrote to me that I should find in London either himself or a letter. Fuller continues to say that if there's a letter in place of Nathan, send it to her care of Marcus Spring. As the Springs covered the cost of her travel, meals, and lodging, as she served as tutor to the young son, Eddie, there is no remark about the cost of delivery. Further, Nathan could, quote, come here as I am told he can in 24 hours by mail from London. The Universal Penny Post, instituted in 1840, extended the London Penny Post of 1680, allowed for cheap delivery beyond the confines of London proper. Postal communication in Great Britain at this time benefited from increasingly developed infrastructure. During the late 17th century, only 6 main postal roads led out of London itself. By 1680, the creation of the penny post by William Dockwra and Robert Murray allowed for mail to be sent for a penny, but only in the boundaries of London. In 1760, road builders started to use hard surfaced highways, and by 1786, stagecoaches could deliver mail from London to Edinburgh in 60 hours, a fact which led to the displeasure of the passengers due to the speed. By 1846, even more improved infrastructure allowed Fuller to enjoy the affordances of British postal delivery with the institution of the Universal Penny Post in 1840, a fact that she alludes to in this letter, albeit briefly. And yet, as always, Fuller was concerned with cost. She most often remarked on this fact to her brother Richard. She ends a September 27th, 1846 letter to Richard sent from Edinburgh with the following directive: get thin paper when you write. Letters are paid for by weight, and the next may have to follow me in my journeys. This admonition is repeated on November 3rd from London to an apparently oblivious Richard, I love this. Write to me of you and whether the Henry affair approaches a happy decision. But when you write, take thin paper. I've already had to pay near $1 for your letters in consequence of your neglecting this. Fuller's more global understanding of how the post worked in different countries may not have been comprehended by Richard. Richard, used to an increasingly more cost-effective United States Postal Service, may not have understood the dynamics of the taxed international post in England. Despite her mobility and the apparent ease with which letters were sent through Great Britain, transatlantic delivery obviously presented different challenges. After arriving in London on October 1st, Fuller writes to her brother Richard the following day that she, quote, was a good deal disappointed to find no letters here from anybody. Pray write when you receive this. I shall be anxious to hear from you and also that mother as well. In her November 3rd letter to Richard, she instructed that, quote, the accompanying letters you can put into the post, except those to Mother, Arthur, and Mrs. F. I wish there was time to write one to you, but no. What does this mean in terms of postal delivery? Personal letters sent together transatlantically could then be distributed separately, either through personal delivery or, as Fuller has instructed, using the post that was developing in the United States at this time. Fortuitously for Fuller, the United States Postal Act of 1845 allowed for cheaper delivery over more well-established routes, a trend that would continue after Fuller's death. Throughout her time in France from November 13th to leaving Paris on February 25th, Fuller begins to leave instructions for having letters sent in care of companies, another complication of postal delivery as Fuller and the Springs leave Great Britain and travel through France. She also often leaves recipients directives regarding how to deliver messages. In a letter to writer and reformer Mary Howitt, dated April 18th, Fuller instructs her to, quote, address me here, care Torlonia and Company. A month later, on May 23rd, Fuller wrote the following to Unitarian Mary Roch, known to many as Aunt Mary. The only thing wanting in your letters has been that you should speak more particularly of your health. Although I know it must be better, or you could not do the things I hear of your doing, I want to know particularly about it. Will you not write to me of that and our other topics of mutual interest and direct care of Green and Company, Paris? I think now I shall remain abroad another year. This letter is evidence that Fuller maintained correspondences that included standard letter content, namely health. Unfortunately, Mary Roch passed away on September 4th, 1848. Yet she did not maintain this standard content for many of her correspondence. On May 23rd, 1847, Fuller explained in a letter to Maria Roch that she had little time for personal correspondence and that, quote, those who are interested in me find it in the Tribune letters. Further experiences I shall probably write out in another form. Letter delivery to friends, of course, also happened through friends. In many cases, Fuller sent notes with others moving in literary or social circles with little evidence that these communications were received in a timely manner. For example, a note written from London on November 10th to John S. Dwight with a superscription of J.S. Dwight, West Roxbury, Massachusetts, begins introducing the deliverer as follows. The bearer of this, Mr. Delph, a citizen at once of England and America and a valued friend of mine. The networks of private delivery necessitated these notes regarding the messenger. Compiler of Fuller's letters, Robert Hudspeth, provides no footnote regarding receipt by Dwight. In other words, there is seemingly no evidence when this letter was received. However, some of Hudspeth's footnotes do remark on delay. For example, in a note to Emerson written on October 30th from London, Fuller begins, my dear friend, this note will be presented to you by Harrow Harrington, of whom I have often spoken to you. This note, with an accompanying copy of Herring's book, did not reach Emerson until nearly 5 months later in March 1847, and was presented to Emerson by Eliza Cabot Fullen, author and anti-slavery activist. In contrast to Fuller's personal letters, her dispatches were regularly published about a month after they were dated. The dispatches, originally conceived of as letters and referred to as letters by Fuller, fit within the category of commercial correspondence, which was paid for through businesses. Greeley paid for this official communication and ensured delivery. By summer 1847, Fuller believed that she had sent her last dispatch as she had completed the agreed upon 15. However, Greeley responded that so many letters as you choose to write will be paid for, and promised payment of $10 for each letter. Greeley also remarked that Fuller could have received more than the $120 for the initial 15 she had written. Yet despite Fuller explaining her dispatches as Tribune letters, only dispatch 1, written on August 23rd, 1846, is published as quote, letters from England on September 24th. The dispatches over this period of travel from Great Britain to France to Italy, beginning with the second dispatch, are published as Things and Thoughts in Europe. Letters become things and thoughts, suggesting that changing education and infrastructural availability of letter delivery, epistolary spaces, are altering understandings of genre. Education access is broadening, as Fuller notes in Dispatch 1, and it occurs as, quote, daughters are self-elected instructors of the people in the way of cutting out from books and pamphlets fragments on the great subjects of the day, which they send about in packages or paste on walls and doors. Fuller comments on women as, quote, self-elected instructors who are using text to spread ideas. While this suggests a changing world in which this could be done through interpersonal communication in an increasingly available postal service, Fuller does not directly remark on these changes. However, she does note that text is, quote, sent about in packages, and applauds greater educational control of self-elected instructors of the people. By contrast, other advancements such as the railroad, which becomes a force for accessible postal delivery, are actually derided by Fuller. Fuller calls the railroad, I love this, the convenient but most unprofitable and stupid way of traveling. Throughout the 1840s, railroad infrastructure had increased to provide fast and efficient travel, while also becoming instrumental in conveying written communication for a wider audience and a more literate population. Though Fuller explicitly remarks on poverty, education, social reform, and cultural exchange in her letters, and most notably in her dispatches, the post itself comes up only in her personal letters. Fuller's political and activist ideas, which formed in her personal correspondence, as Magdalena Nerio asserts, may have eventually taken shape to include advocating for the postal changes and reforms that occurred throughout the 19th century. So in considering my main questions of how Fuller explicitly addressed the post in her personal letters, and whether or not she attended to the revolutionary impact of increasingly accessible postal systems, it seems she had inadvertently done so. Perhaps, had Fuller lived to look back on postal expansion, she may very well have understood the great impact of an increasingly accessible post and would have been able to understand her role as a part of this system. When reading archival records of the past, we are in a similar space as Fuller, the personal letter writer, wanting to be in conversation, yet not fully able to be. Maybe this is why Fuller's letters and dispatches from this turbulent and terrific time, a period of travel, culture, and custom, do not more pointedly write about such a public and personal space, where she does not view epistolary spaces themselves as more revolutionary. To be sure, her time in Italy superseded much, as she was witness to rebellion while also giving birth to her son, Angelo. But from afar, we see she also bore witness to revolutions of words through postal networks that are guided by a governmental public hand. From London on October 6, 1846, Fuller wrote to Alexander Ireland, whom she had met in England, that she had, quote, found your note here several days since and have been vainly trying to get a moment to answer it ever since. I have found Fuller's letters several years since, and I too have tried to find a moment to answer in some fashion what Fuller might offer in terms of understanding letter writing in the 19th century world, speculating on our understanding of the post itself. Questions of access, which Fuller contemplated partly in terms of social reform and education, I consider through the developing post and greater global communicative means and methods. I can only imagine Fuller thriving here as the Thoreau gathering is held simultaneously in person and remote, able to collapse time and space in a way that affords so many voices entrance into conversation. Thank you.
I am not Mario Benoni. If any of you missed my introductory comments, I will say that with regret, Mario tells us that he is unable to be here and has asked me to read his paper for him. So here is the opposing political passions and common womanly positions of Margaret Fuller and Costanza Arconati Visconsi on the eve of the Italian Risorgimento. And this begins with Mario in the first person. When about 16 years ago, I met the name of Margaret Fuller in a book by an Italian author and decided to understand who she was, I only knew her as a firsthand witness of the Roman Revolution. Knowing her better, I learned how up to date, captivating, full of facts and contradictions, and how advanced with the ideas of her time she was, how immersed in the culture and spirituality of New England, and yet in love with the art, history, and fate of our country, as to claim herself a daughter of Italy. But what struck me most were her many metamorphoses, since she changed and matured under more than one aspect. She came as a foreign correspondent, but also an American tourist. She left deeply involved in Italian life, able to understand the language, customs, economy, history, religion, and even Italian politics, an almost impossible task for a foreigner. She came proclaiming women's emancipation and left as a mother and wife, if she ever formally married, who had established a solid relationship with her partner despite their great difference. She came carrying the reputation of a pedantic and arrogant woman, often intent on asserting herself through her cultural gifts, and became more serene, tolerant, and able to accept others. She came with an interest in new political theories, but by the end, she was a partisan and war reporter. Symptomatic of her ability to accept and live diversity in full harmony was her relationship with friend Costanza Arcanati Visconti, an influential member of the Italian Moderate Party with whom she met and corresponded all during her stay. Costanza, 10 years older than Margaret, was born to Marquis Trotti Bentivoglio and an Australian noblewoman, and at the age of 18 had married her cousin, Marquis Giuseppe Arcanati Visconti, following the patriotic riots following the patriotic riots of 1821, had to exile to France and Belgium, where their castle of Gospik near Brussels became a refuge for many Italian patriots. They had returned to Italy only after the 1838 amnesty, but continued to oppose the Austrian rule of Lombardy. And in 1848, they had been part of the League Against Tobacco, imitating the American Tea Party that started the Italian Revolution. Costanza's political view included very little tolerance. When Fuller told her about the other women she met, she almost always criticized them, especially the Milanese noblewoman, Cristina di Belgioso, the future leader of the Committee for the Wounded of the Roman Republic. Costanza despised Belgioso for her radicalism and looseness. She had founded a utopian socialist commune, supported radicals and Republicans, and was mother to a daughter with an unknown partner. Unlike those women, Costanza had no need to imagine a different and more important role for women in the new post-revolutionary Italy, because she and her circle already played a prominent role, even in comparison with that of ordinary noble and wealthy people. To use Fuller's words, she was really the lady of large lands. She and her husband both felt the duties that came with a position of command. In sum, she was part of the winning aristocratic class, and directly or indirectly already determined the future of the country. Nevertheless, Costanza and Fuller became close friends. They met for the first time in Rome in April 1847, when they visited Via Ludovisi together and soon became better acquainted. The two women did not know each other's languages well enough to converse or exchange letters in either English or Italian. So imagine their long friendship and its record by letter as taking place in French, a second language for each and for many other cultivated Europeans. My work of editing those letters in both directions has therefore been a double translation from French into two editions, one Italian, uniformly Italian, and the other English. This language refraction is almost a symbol of their remarkable relationship. Despite their many differences, or perhaps rather because of them, they visited for the summer in Milan and at Bellagio on Lake Como, where Costanza hosted Margaret in her villa. Now they learned deeply of each other. After that stay, Costanza wrote to Margaret, "I am meditating on the things you have told me and regretting that you are no longer close to me. I love you, and I have the greatest admiration for you. The presence of true merit and real greatness has impressed my soul. I gradually opened my eyes. It is not only a pleasure that I owe you, it is a blessing. The spectacle of moral beauty raises the soul. I embrace you with gratitude, my dear friend." Fuller had evidently replied, claiming her positions and highlighting the risk that their differences might distance them. So in another letter, Costanza assured her, "What I wrote to you from Bellagio was a sincere expression of my sentiments, and I am sure that any difference that may be between us will not make me grow distant. I cannot deceive myself as to the elevation and energy of your soul, and your opinions cannot change my idea. They agree to be close to one another, even if they belong to different nations and were divided in their beliefs." In fact, Margaret was a Protestant, which for most Roman Catholics meant to be heterodox or even heretic, and a political visionary, siding with Giuseppe Mazzini's idea of unifying Italy, which was then divided into at least 7 major states. These were to be democratic republics, respectful of civil and social issues and foreseeing a separation between the civil and religious spheres. Costanza, on the other hand, was a Roman Catholic and as a member of the higher aristocracy, sided with those who wanted Italy unified by the King of Piedmont, who had paid little attention to social and civil issues and had proclaimed Catholicism his state religion. 10 years later, the position of Arconati Visconti would prevail. A process ending in 1870 with the liberation of Rome, until then under French annexation as part of the Kingdom of Italy, which had been proclaimed 9 years before. But at the time of Fuller's stay from 1847 to 50, the options of republic and kingdom remained in contention. In fact, after the disastrous War of 1848 was lost by the King of Piedmont, the Republican option seemed to acquire vitality, so much so that in Rome, Florence, Genoa, and Venice, separate republics were declared to constitute the democratic nucleus around which all the rest of Italy could join. But this was not to be, because foreign intervention came to terrorize Tuscans, bombard Genoese, starve Venetians, demolish the Roman Republic, and bring the Pope back to an undeserved throne. When Fuller and Arconati met in the second part of 1847, Republicans and moderate supporters of the king were not yet radically opposed to each other. Mazzini, leader of the Republicans, wrote a long letter, mainly well received by moderates, to convince the newly elected Pope, who is mistakenly considered a liberal, to guide the unification process. But Pope Pius rejected the proposal during an institutional speech after having openly ignored it for some time. Knowing Mazzini's letters, but ignoring the Pope's refusal, Fuller had written an article whose manuscript I have been able to trace, subsequently published by the British newspaper, The People's Journal, to support Mazzini's move. From this letter, we could learn the real words Fuller spoke at that time in her position as a significant foreign political observer. The occasion was given her by some British papers rudely attacking Mazzini as sanguinary, bloodthirsty. She wrote, "To couple the epithet sanguinary with the name of Mazzini would be simply absurd as to speak of the darkness of light. Italy is not weaned from Mazzini. A moderate party which at present moves in Italy certainly hopes for salvation by means which are not Mazzini's. One so deeply penetrated as he with the truth that liberty is an inborn right of man cannot demand it as a boon at the hands of princes. The noble heart of the present pontiff has opened an unexpected door. Those who are now in Italy must rejoice that a degree of liberty of the press and the rudiments of civil institutions are introducing some light into the joy that has rested on the lower orders. And if many members of the moderate party wedded to another mode of proceeding might dread the presence of Mazzini, fearing he would seek to outgo their present methods, it is our belief that there is one, that is the Pope, who would at least comprehend his spirit, and that the heart, the mind, the faith of so pure a lover of mankind would be duly prized by Pius IX. About those sanguinary charges against Mazzini, Margaret's moderate friend Costanza initially wrote, "I did not believe in the calumny that accused Mazzini, since you made him love me. I am no longer unjust to him. It is his partisans, the tail of his party, that does him wrong." On the other hand, when Fuller complained that she had sent to the Italian newspapers the account concerning the great meeting held in New York in support of the Pope, together with a final address to praise his reforms, and they had not released it, Costanza, who well knew the American idealism of Emerson and Fuller, replied to Fuller, "You are right to be hurt by the indifference with which that noble tribute of your country's sympathy has been received. Yes, my dear friend, we have not yet paid justice to America in old Europe." But when in 1848, the King's Independence War burst out in northern Italy, she quickly became less compliant toward the Republican Mazzini. "My dear friend, from what you said about him, I think of Mazzini as an honest and good faith man, but he's the leader of a party, and in the face of this attribute, everything else disappears. A few months ago, I would have been able to meet him despite being of an opinion contrary to his, but at this moment in which parties act, or when it is not a matter of mere theory, there is an insurmountable wall between Mazzini and my entourage. We judge Mazzini and his party the ruin of Italy." Even though Fuller sided precisely with that party, Costanza maintained great personal respect for her, and over time, they continued to build a solid friendship based, apart from the rest, on their common experience as women and mothers. But this was an experience affirmed only after conscious renegotiating of their friendship, because Margaret's motherhood had followed a romantic liaison with Giovanni Angelo Ascoli, Roman partisan and young scion of the lower nobility, rather than a landed aristocratic marriage like Costanza's. In flight with Ascoli after the revolution's demise, before leaving Rieti, the town where she had given birth and had her child Angelo nursed while she was helping the revolution in Rome, Margaret wrote to Costanza unveiling her relationship and the birth of their son, now a year old. Above all, she expressed concern for her friend's possible rejection of either Fuller's liaison or her long silence about it. Margaret wrote, "I earnestly wish you may not feel estranged, but only if you do, I would rather for you to act upon it. Let us meet as friends or not at all. In all events, I remain ever yours." But Costanza replied from her own temporary stopping place in Turin, "In you, I do not see any change of state that could affect our relationship. Instead, there will be a bond between us because we will be able to unite our maternal condition. And further in the same letter, I know you're Republican and radical, but it is not Mazzini you married, and we will not be separated by differences of politics any more than we were before. Margaret replied in some relief, with you, I indeed thought it would be so. It gladdens my heart indeed that you do not care, and we may meet in love. And meet they did. Through the winter of 1849 and 50, both Margaret and Costanza lived in Florence before Margaret and her family's ill-fated voyage back to America. Pardon me, I thought that was silent. Thank you. We know this, I'm going to start again. And meet they did. Through the winter of 1849-50, both Margaret and Costanza lived in Florence before Margaret and her family's ill-fated voyage back to America. And they conversed almost every day. We know this because after the shipwreck on the American shore that ended Margaret's life, Costanza wrote to Margaret's sister Ellen and told her of that long final conversation. This disclosure is among the letters previously available only in French, but now translated into English as part of my edition of Fuller's Italian correspondence. Ellen had written to Costanza with news of the shipwreck, and she told in response how moved she had been at a message that itself gave evidence of Margaret's, quote, tender and sincere affection for me, end quote. Knowing that Margaret had long since written to her family of their friendship amounted to a gift, as Costanza put it, a good that survived her. And now this record remains still one of value. The bond between Fuller and Costanza was a cross-cultural, cross-lingual, politically fraught friendship cut short only by death, and even after that, cherished.
Hello, everyone on Zoom and everyone in the room, and especially the panel. It's an honor to be included in this Margaret Fuller panel, as this brought me to a new world. And the title of my presentation answers the question of our panel. Where in the world is Margaret Fuller? Margaret Fuller is in China. She had never traveled to China, of course, but still she is very much in China. So just in the process, I just follow her steps, and I'm sharing my finding with you. So there are two sections of my presentation. First is Margaret Fuller and China. That was in the US and in the 19th century. And the second part is Margaret Fuller in China, in today's China, in the 20th century. So that was, the first part was about Margaret Fuller's knowledge of China and the Chinese culture, Chinese philosophy. So in this, I'm sure everybody here knows a little bit more than I do. It's about her own capacity as the journalist, the editor, the writer. So I went through the publication of the Chinese philosophy texts in Dial. So she was the editor, and some of the Confucius text came in, but it was right after Emerson took over, after Margaret Fuller resigned. But in the circle, it's people were reading, and Thoreau in Warden, he actually did some of the translation himself, of course, indirectly from French. But still, this is from Megan Marshall's Margaret Fuller, A New American Life. So I'm using secondhand material to prove that she was actually reading and using, and I quote, working at her desk in Fishkill Landing, Margaret had surrounded herself with volumes of Spinoza, Confucius, and Plato, spread open for reference, and she made use of them. So this is, so she was, she had access to the Chinese philosophical text. But this is more, the next funny is more. I'm kind of traveling across time and space, and this is me discovering with really pleasant surprise of the historical coincidence that she might not have been aware, but was taking place right when she was making a difference in history. But a lot of other changes are happening around her as well. So this is when she was doing her conversation, that historical event, that breakthrough happened at the same time with the growth of the Chinese community in Boston. So, and physically, yesterday's session, some panelists talked about the evidence of history and also the historical junction. So here is exactly the crossroad of women's history and diversification of Boston. So I think this fits really nicely into the theme of this year's Thoreau annual gathering, the global Thoreau. So it's globalization. So what I found was this brochure of people, for people to walk around Boston. And it's to walk around Chinatown and South Cove Walk. And the beginning point is the bookstore, is Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore. So I'm going to read it for people who can, the text is too small, so I'll read it out. The Chinatown South Cove Walk began with the bookshop of Elizabeth Peabody, which is best known as the location of the 1839 to 44 conversations led by Margaret Fuller, which helped crystallize New England Transcendentalism, a movement encouraging the perfection of each individual. So you can see the picture and the bookstore very much, I think that looks like the way it was before, but it's a historical testimony of the two progresses that was taking place at the same time, and they intersect at this one physical place. So for me, that was really a very, very happy discovery. So, but my main reading and the points that I want to share with you is the how Chinese people are reading her and introducing her to the broader Chinese audience, with 1.4 billion people there who is reading and who is writing about her and how the public are receiving her. So I went over some archival resources. So from the Chinese side, so I discovered 5 master's theses, and I've discovered some journal articles and translation. And then I also went over the English books available to the Chinese readers, and also the books written in Chinese by the Chinese authors. And then eventually my curiosity also drove me to the social media about her popularity in the general public. So So I'm gonna go over each list in detail. So I discovered 5 master's theses. The titles are translated by the master's students themselves. So as a rule, you write in Chinese, but still you have to give an English abstract. One of them was written in English because it was written by English literature major. So I'll go over the title really quickly. Transcendentality of Margaret Fuller's flower language imagery writing. That's one. Second is the pioneer of American feminism, a study on Margaret Fuller's minds. The third one, a comparative study of Margaret Fuller, a new American life from the perspective of feminist translation studies. That's the one, that's my favorite one. The fourth one is analysis of Margaret Fuller, a new American life from the perspective of positive psychology. The last one is a transcendentalist reading of Margaret Fuller's Women in the 19th Century. So what's interesting is, I thought about our panel. We have our chair is a woman, and then we have 3 women presenters, and then there's 1 man. So I'm guessing this 5 was also the same kind of gender distribution. So at least 1 is a man. So I'm happy to see that. And also they are all master's theses. The master's thesis is a little more heavyweight than in here in the US universities, because I did my master's there and I did my PhD here. Here, master's is more, it's quicker, less weighted. But over there, a thesis is a very important part of getting a master's degree. Usually it takes 2 to 3 years, at least 2 years, but some of them 3 years. So they did do a lot of reading, and then they write this thesis. Another one is the years are fairly recent but quick. Look at number 3 and 4, 2015, 2016. Megan Marshall's book came out in 2014. So 2015, 2016, they were already writing master's thesis about it. So that means they're very much connected to the academic world here. And also the universities, they're also fairly prestigious. So so that shows they think it's important enough for them to write their master's thesis on Margaret Fuller. So here, I'll go very quickly. I'm conscious of the time. So this is my favorite one is mainly also because I'm a translator myself, but her writing is of course objective, it's an academic paper, but it really brought Margaret Fuller closer to my heart. So she used Megan Marshall's Margaret Fuller biography as an example of how you translate a feminist book into a different language. So so through her, I learned the theory about supplementing, preface, and footnotes, and hijacking. So, and then she gave some examples, and it really, I just said, wow, that's true. So about supplements, it's cousins. Like in Chinese, you don't know that you have to specify male, female from father's side, and then in the language itself, it already shows. But if it's from English, she says, make sure you don't forget the girls. So when you translate cousins, it's not just the boys, the girls too. And then another one is also fraternal communication. Fraternal, it's not just the men, but also the women as well. And it's about hijack. Hijack sounds like a bad word, but the way she explains it, it's just how to just soften, put a little light touch to the language. Because since you're as the translator, you have this power. You soften the language, and also you make it, if it's negative, you make it a little neutral or even positive. And just that's where you can, with your own feminist perspective, you can improve the translation of the original text and make sure that it reflects what the author originally intended. And then also there are some examples like sensual pleasure, information, suggestions, they would have come out like negative terms in the Chinese culture, but then she says, oh, you can use this word, then people don't look at them in a negative light. I looked in this, so this 5 theses all came from this, it's called Chinese National Knowledge Infrastructure. It's just a very good archive. So, so the good ones made into it. Of course, there are others that are not there. So I also went through 14 journal articles. So, so I'm gonna, since this overlaps with the books I'm gonna talk about, so I'm gonna skip the details. So then I went through 23 books. In this one particular archive, that's a different archive. So they listed 23 books that had reference to Margaret Fuller. So here, Fu, I had to smile, just think about the translation. Fu in Chinese, the 2 characters people used, one means rich, and the other one means fortunate or lucky. So that's how they, because she was a good woman. So if it's some bad one, they may have chosen another character. So they chose some nice words for her name. So I searched and I found 23 books. 23 books. I think the Margaret Fuller experts here can tell me that actually the first 4, they are probably just a mirror of what we would have seen in the English or some Western source material. So Margaret Fuller in American history in general. So you might talk about her, or as a member of the Transcendentalist Club, you talk about her, or as a member of the American Romanticism, yes, you talk about her, and also especially on her own right as a pioneer in feminist history. So I think in this, I don't blame them, but I assume in this aspects, a lot of it were mostly translation, transplanting, introductory. I don't expect any original discovery because of access to material, and also they're young, they're just students. And I do know some scholars that do some research on Margaret Fuller, but that's not their main profession. So so they are studying Emerson. Then they discovered Margaret Fuller and they wrote something about her. But those 4, I expect they're just introductory. But then there's also education. That's so about transcendentalism and individualism in the 19th century. So I discovered a lot of writing about that. But the most interesting part are the last 2 is writing example and famous quotes. And these are for students learning English, students including the English majors and also the kids. The parents want them to learn English. And also Margaret Fuller was used as an example of in a lot of the success story. Yeah, okay, I'll wrap up quickly. So so in the American, so the good example of about this letter, of course, people quote each other too. So they have the collection of quotes, and then people, so Margaret's letter to her brother Arthur, December 20th, 1840, that letter was quoted all over the place with English and then Chinese translation, and everybody was quoting it. And so, and then so I listed all the famous books that are using it. Of course, they're not conscious about political correctness, so they're still using the word savage. So this is more, I have mixed feeling about this, a role model for success. So there are a lot of popular successology books, and they use her as an example and her sayings. So Dale Carnegie, so it quote her as like, I accept the universe. And then also Orison Martin, cheerfulness as a life power. So I don't know how Margaret Fuller would think about that, but that's how people read it. And for a lot of people, this might be the first place they hear about Margaret Fuller. So translation, I do want to highlight. None of her own writing has been translated, other than just the quotes, the letters. But then her biography has been translated. Megan Marshall's Margaret Fuller, A New American Life has been translated in ebook form. But I subscribed and I checked, only 20 chapters have been published. And then there are a lot of books that refer to Margaret Fuller. This is the English books that they had access just through that Chinese national knowledge infrastructure. These are the books. So mostly her letters, the 6th volume from Cornell University, that is available. And there's 11 books just from this archive. I'm sure they have other access to other books as well. And then these are the English sources. And the last one, so 20 seconds. So this is a website that I participate the most. And they have a group for the Concord authors. And this number, so I'm sure there are some journalists can tell me whether this also mirrors the popularity of these authors in the United States. And in any case, Thoreau is 950, Hawthorne 626, Emerson 362, Louisa May 252, Margaret Fuller 27. I checked this in June. I think something has to be done about it.
We have at least a few minutes for questions. These 4 papers take us far and wide. They're very different from each other. I don't expect you to bring them all together, but any part of it that you would like to ask about, please do.
Like, I had a comment. I think that these papers express the letter and spirit of our conference theme. And in a really exciting way.
Thank you.
And I'm personally very excited about increasing the knowledge through the Thoreau Society, which really makes so much sense spiritually, that she would get the recognition that she deserves globally through the prism of Thoreau studies. So I'm very excited. Thank you.
I hope you could all hear that directly, could you? I don't think I can try to paraphrase it. Go ahead.
The dispassion. When you say that the broad dimensions of letter writing, would you say that other parts of the dimensions to do something? Or is she something else?
Okay, so in short, the question is, do the dispatches depart from the conventions of letter writing? The dispatches change themselves. So, I focused mainly on the first 12, 13, which read more like travel writing, which is a whole separate genre in itself, as opposed to, from my estimation, as opposed to letters. which kind of speaks to, I had mentioned Nerio's chapter about Fuller developing her ideas and philosophy through her letters, as opposed to more conventional, openings with health and things like that. She does retain some of that, but a lot of her letters themselves defied certain conventions of the genre too. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think in short, that's what happened. And you probably have a much better answer than me. Sorry.
Nail that really was well, but it was he was waiting for
Yes, she would have to wait for a ship to take it, and she sent them back. And what I noticed is, at least in the first 12, and I think this changes around 13, 14, what happens is they're published about a month after. So she's able to send them on ships that are able to get them there very quickly, as opposed to with her what would be called familiar letters. Her personal correspondence was also sent in some fashion, but a little bit more slapdash. It might be a delivery of someone else who was leaving to return home. It might be, personal delivery systems, which more closely model, 18th century and the early 19th century deal. So what would be fascinating is if, well, we would all say this, but had Fuller been able to continue her work post 1850, it would be fascinating to look at what her letters look like after that point, when postal delivery changed even further. So I think that the dispatches were a bit more regular. She was also owed Greeley work. Yes. As far as I can make out, he advanced her that, paid for the postage. And even when she stopped writing and he said, I'll pay you 10 per, there's no way he wouldn't pay for it. She's not sending Greeley a note, you cost me near $1 for these dispatches, right? So cost would have been paid for by him, as well as the fact that in Britain at that time, this is how they're making money. They're making money on those transatlantic correspondences, and they want to tax that. And companies are Greeley's going to pay for this foreign correspondent for sure. Did I answer your question? Okay, good. It's also, well, now I'm talking about something else completely. Let's stop.
facts and figures aside, with appreciation to each one, say tomorrow history review achievement. So we'll have another one. Yeah. It's like another thing.
One probably long sentence. But to answer your question, I think what Margaret Fuller means to me is that there was so much potential for navigating social reform and change that she represents. And I hate to break this down into gender because I think that's become much more complicated, but in a 19th century understanding, a woman being able to live and work within a predominantly male space. And that's a gross oversimplification, but that would be the short answer. And I admire that.
So Margaret Fuller just makes me feel like how fortunate we are to live in today. Because when I read, she said, oh, please send you, she wanted the United States send an ambassador to Italy. And she said, well, maybe like, she knew she wouldn't be able to be that ambassador, but if she lived today, she would have been the first one.
Yeah.
So, and I wish she were here.
I think you probably is. We're in the world, Margaret. We're happier. Thank you all. Okay,